Hey everyone, I figured I would kick this video off with sort of an esoteric topic. This is more for advanced Bitcoiners, so if you're new to Bitcoin, this is probably a bit of Bitcoin history that is not worth knowing at this stage, so feel free to skip this one. But if you're intermediate or moderate or expert level Bitcoiner, you might be interested in some of this. So what was Bitcoin's block size war between 2015 and 2017? All right, so here's the quick history. Bitcoin is invented. The white paper comes out October 31st of 2008, and Bitcoin enters the marketplace on January 3rd of 2009. So Bitcoin starts trading, and there's essentially so little transaction volume that it's not a problem at all. But the way Bitcoin is set up, the blocks of transactions are processed on the network once every 10 minutes. And so a logical question would be, well, how many transactions should need to be able to be processed every 10 minutes in order for Bitcoin to scale worldwide? And another consideration is, what about spam? How do you keep somebody from generating a huge number of, just basically bogus transactions, or maybe they're legitimate transactions, but each one is moving like one Satoshi, and you just flood the network with a huge amount of basically useless transactions, similar to email spam. So Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin himself, put a limit in Bitcoin to 1 megabyte per block. And he did that because he said, look, if the network scales at 1 megabyte per block, there's never going to be a problem with the network scaling to be too large to run on an individual home computer. So even Bitcoin itself right now, you can technically run the entire blockchain on your home laptop or desktop computer or whatever. You can fit the entire Bitcoin blockchain. It's about 560 gigabytes. So it fits on the entire thing fits on a home computer. And if you want to personally validate every single transaction that has ever happened on the Bitcoin network, you can personally do that yourself on your home computer right now, the entire history of Bitcoin since 2009, all by yourself. And the only reason you can do that is because the blocks are only 1 megabyte every 10 minutes. So Satoshi did not want somebody spamming the network. So he put a 1 megabyte limit in and said, hey, maybe we raise this later. It sort of fell by the wayside. Okay, so we have this 1 megabyte limit. Satoshi Nakamoto disappears, the inventor of Bitcoin, he disappears. The network keeps growing, and a debate breaks out a number of years later as to, should we increase the block size? Meaning how many transactions can fit in a single block, and should that amount be larger than 1 megabyte? So it turns into, over the course of a couple of years, ultimately primarily between 2015 and 2017, although it technically started maybe bubbling up a little before that, a massive, massive epic battle over the future of Bitcoin. And because the arguments were, it turned into two camps, the big blockers and the small blockers. The big blockers said Bitcoin needs to be able to be used for payments like Visa or MasterCard. And in order to do that, we need really big blocks that can handle huge amounts of transaction volume. The small blockers, who ultimately won the war, the small blockers said no. The value of Bitcoin is in its decentralization and security, and the ability for every single human to validate the entire blockchain themselves. And if we allow large blocks, that's going to mean it's super low transaction fees, and there will not be an incentive for the miners to mine the blocks. As the halvings happen every 4 years, eventually those go down to zero. And if you allow really large blocks, there's not an incentive for miners to mine. So we need to limit the blocks, and then the debate, of course, was how big they should be limited. Ultimately, a hybrid solution was come up with that allowed the blocks to go up to a few megabytes, but it was still the core data was limited at 1 megabyte, and additional data could be included in creative ways. So ultimately, this massive battle played out, the big blockers versus the small blockers, and there was, of course, accusations of censorship and, all of the sort of typical accusations you would normally get in a pitched battle over the ideology of something. But it ultimately came down to the big blockers who wanted Bitcoin to scale for use as payments, and the small blockers who wanted security and decentralization to be central, and then build on top of that for payments. So their logic was, hey, we can always build payment networks. Humans have built payment networks for hundreds of years and electronically for decades. And there's no reason to potentially screw up Bitcoin by trying to make it a payment network when in reality it can never really be a payment network due to the scale of what would be required to do, unless you end up with blocks so big that only a few companies can run them. And so the concern by the small blockers were, if the blocks are big enough to handle huge numbers of transactions like a payment networks like Visa's, then the blocks will be so large that only a few companies will be able to run them. And then at that point, how is it more decentralized than the Federal Reserve? Because right now, a very small number of entities control how much money there is. The beauty of Bitcoin is it's completely decentralized and there's no way to cheat the system. And the small blockers were concerned that if the blocks got too big, they'd fill up with spam. People would start streaming movies into the Bitcoin blockchain, filling it up with pictures, images, junk, whatever. And with no limit on the block size, the blocks would get so large that they would become unmanageable. And pretty soon you'd have to trust a company to tell you whether everything in the Bitcoin blockchain was legit. And they felt like the big benefit of Bitcoin was you don't have to trust anyone to tell you if it's legit. You can pull out your home laptop and check for yourself. And so anyway, ultimately the small blockers were more of the ideological purists, and ultimately they won the battle. And a lot of the big blockers split off and started something called Bitcoin Cash, which trades under the ticker BCH. So the real Bitcoin is BTC. And there's something called Bitcoin Cash, which trades under the ticker BCH, which is their version of what they thought Bitcoin should be. Now, Bitcoin Cash trades for less than 1% of the value of a Bitcoin. So even though both of them are out there on the marketplace, Bitcoin Cash has been trending towards zero ever since its invention. Just like Shiba Inu and Dogecoin and all of those other things will eventually trend towards zero, Bitcoin Cash is also trending towards zero. So that is the Bitcoin block size war. Mostly took place between 2015 and 2017. It was an ideological battle over the future of Bitcoin, whether it should be a payment network or whether payment networks should be built on top of Bitcoin, like the Lightning Network, or even using networks like Visa or MasterCard. And in my case, with the Coinbase debit card, it uses the Visa network. So of course, it's spending Bitcoin, but it's spending Bitcoin via a layer 2 solution, which is a solution on top of Bitcoin, which is Coinbase with the Coinbase debit card. And then the combination of that and the Visa network are making it all work. So anyways, that was the sort of epic showdown. The small blockers won, which means even today there's a 1 megabyte block size limit on the size of a Bitcoin block, which means if you want to transfer value, you have to bid to have your transaction included. So right now, as I'm recording this, it costs about $3 to get a Bitcoin transaction in the base chain if you want it to go through right away. So that $3 is essentially the result of the block size limit. Because if you bid less than that, then your transaction's not going to get in the very next block. Now, the upside of that is, of course, those transaction fees are enough to make the Bitcoin network viable, even if there's no block reward. By having those transaction fees in there, because the block size is limited, if the block size was unlimited, there would be no reason to have transaction fees, and therefore there'd be no incentive for the miners to secure and audit the network. So small blockers won. There will always be an incentive for miners to audit and secure the Bitcoin network, because there are transaction fees that make that a profitable endeavor. And the trade-off, which is a big one, but the trade-off with that is payment networks have to be layer 2, because the core chain is too expensive to transact with to buy a cup of coffee. Obviously, you don't want to buy a $3 cup of coffee and then pay a $3 transaction fee on the Bitcoin base layer. But again, that is being solved by the Bitcoin's Lightning Network. The Lightning Network is a layer 2 payments network that is built on top of the Bitcoin network that is specifically intended to solve Bitcoin's scaling problem. So long term, the goal is to have Bitcoin as the base layer, the Bitcoin Lightning Network as the payments layer. And the goal there is to give you all the benefits of a base layer that is ultra secure and ultra decentralized, and then have a payments layer which is not as decentralized and not as secure, but also manages very small amounts of Bitcoin. So who cares? You don't care if your cup of coffee, something goes wrong on that layer 2 solution. Just like with Visa, you get chargebacks and things like that. But if there's a chargeback on a cup of coffee or your Visa card won't go through for some reason, it's not like it's the end of the world. Versus if the Bitcoin base layer, something happens there, obviously that involves more than $1 trillion of value, and in the future, probably many trillions of dollars of value. So anyway, that's the Bitcoin block size wars in a nutshell. There's a lot more I could say about it. So if there's any interest, I'll record a more detailed video, but that's probably more detailed than average people even care about anyway. So there you go. Hopefully it's helpful.